Hello, and thank you for joining A Shark's Perspective. What do you remember about any ad or brand? What makes your marketing and communications efforts memorable? Are you even spending enough time making your advertising memorable? Or is the focus mainly on making them very creative? Is it simply frequency, creative, emotion in the ads and content? Or is it something deeper that is better described with cognitive neuropsychology and how this resonates with the brain? How do you stay on people's minds? Dr. Carmen Simon is the founder of Memzy, an instructor at Stanford University, an author, and she's a subject matter expert who holds doctorates in both instructional technology as well as cognitive psychology. And on this episode, we'll discuss balancing some of the tips and tricks and best practices needed to make your advertising and content more memorable, contextual, and relatable to consumers with simpler and more unified messaging. So let's tune in to a memory expert with a memorable shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. All right, Carmen, thank you so much for joining us today on A Shark's Perspective. If you would please tell us a little bit about your background and your career to date.
I am Carmen Simon. I am a cognitive neuroscientist, which means that I study the brain. It's an intriguing profession because everybody in your audience has a brain.
Hmm.
So it's fun to understand how it works. My specialty is memory as it relates to what makes corporate communication memorable. And I'm intrigued to approach the topic of communication from a neuroscientific perspective because these days we have made such great advancements where the brain is concerned. And we use all sorts of technologies. We specialize in our company in the use of EEG technology, electroencephalogram technology. And through that, we place a set of electrodes on people's scalps.
Mm-hmm.
And as they are exposed to stimulation, let's just say a presentation, a corporate pitch, an investor pitch, the brain has all sorts of electrical activity that is going on inside it. So we capture that through these electrodes. And after we record these brain waves, we place them through all sorts of statistical programs and we detect what happens when and whether something attracted your attention, whether you stayed focused, whether something made you drowsy or kept you alert.
Mm-hmm.
And we then correlate that with what you remember a few days later after exposure.
So, what drove your interest in particular memory and leveraging this from a business purpose? I mean, you could have gone in a lot of different directions, other than working with corporations.
You can go many directions. You're definitely right, and the draw to any profession comes from probably a combination of personal and professional reasons.
Sure.
For personal reasons, I noticed how much content we forget even when we are the creators of that content. For example, I live here near San Francisco. I remember a while back watching that movie, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Have you seen that movie, the
I
Swedish version?
I have actually, yeah, the original.
The original version in which the protagonist is this woman. She's so dark and so edgy, and she's so great at hacking things. And at some point in the movie, you can see her sitting on a windowsill overlooking Stockholm. She's sitting in this 21 room apartment that she had bought with some enlisted money. And you can catch just very briefly a glimpse of her humanity because she's very taken with the sunset over Stockholm. And I thought, I must see what she saw. So I booked a plane ticket from San Francisco to Stockholm and I went there. And for about 5 days,
Hmm.
I just got so enamored with the ice bars and the galleries and the canals and the people and of course the you had to channel your inner queen at the ABBA museum, those sorts of things. And coming back to the airport, so to return to San Francisco, I thought, wasn't there something that I came here to see? I had totally forgotten about the darkness and the edginess of my protagonist, and I thought, gosh, if we forget our own content so much, things that we set for ourselves to do so much, how much do other people forget from what we
Hmm.
tell them?
Yeah, well, you're talking to the guy with the shark tattoos who has a short-term attention span, so it is seems very poignant. This is a topic that that I'm fascinated by. And I've been anxious and eager to speak with you since I heard you speak at a conference. And you, of course, gave a stellar presentation. And it's something that, for so many people, I think they have a problem defining: is it the attention span of a goldfish? Is it too much noise? Is it that we don't remember enough? But all of it is, at least to me, whatever piece of it is, I don't think people are spending time focused on our brands, obviously, as much as marketers love to focus on, because one, they don't have time. They've got other competitors that are hitting them with messages. There are other messages. There's the wife, husband, kids, whatever. And to me, it's one of the reasons I find this part of advertising and marketing so incredibly interesting, because I don't think that enough focus is really put on making an ad memorable. So we spend too much time on things that don't make an ad memorable, but we spend so much time on making it creative. But creative doesn't always mean making it memorable, if you will. So kind of at least unpack your thoughts of that babble, and tell me I'm crazy or not.
Well, let's address this from various angles. There are a few things that you said that caught my attention. One of the advantages of using neuroscience in creating marketing materials, communication materials, is that we can debunk a lot of myths where
Mm-hmm.
the brain is concerned. And one such myth is that we have a shorter attention span.
Mm-hmm.
The statistic about human beings have the attention span of a goldfish is simply not valid. And the way to attest this, even for yourself, you don't even have to undergo some statistical studies of any sort. All you have to wonder is what is the longest show that you have binge watched lately. See, we have, and even our listeners right now, if you ask yourself, what was the longest amount of hours that I spent watching something or being involved in something, we know that the human brain is capable of paying prolonged amount of attention on to something. But what has changed lately for the modern brain is not the attention span, is the threshold for stimulation. These days, the modern brain wants to be constantly stimulated. So as we create communication materials, as we create marketing materials, don't worry so much about the short attention span. Worry more about how frequent your stimulus change is. To borrow from a Hollywood term, is how often do you provide a cut? So, for example, if you create a presentation, or if you create a video, or if you create a webinar, or whatever your means are to engage with your audiences, wonder, am I sitting on the same stimulus for minutes at a time? And minutes in these days, the world is almost an invitation to multitask,
Sure.
because unless you switch, then it's a lot harder to sustain focus for a prolonged amount of time.
So when you talk to clients, are you getting pushback from brands who maybe think they've already oversimplified their message, or maybe they think they have, I'm going to put in air quotes, many layers that need to be explained out in much more detail?
It's intriguing to us to observe this rhythm of simplicity versus complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a topic that's very dear to my heart as a cognitive neuroscientist, because another myth that we can debunk is that simplicity is memorable. Simplicity is desirable to the brain because the brain would rather not expand a whole lot of cognitive energy thinking about things. But simplicity, after a while, becomes a snoozer. So, as a communicator, always wonder, how much do I give the brain of both, something that is simple and something that is complex? Besides, your audience's brains would not even appreciate something that is simple unless they recognize the complexity from which it has come. So, as perhaps your audiences might be from a technology related field, something that is fairly difficult to understand at first, you can approach the brain with a simple message, but after a while, be prepared to go in some depth and some other layers, because the brain will be ready for that. Just for the reasons that we just outlined, unless you switch the stimulus, it's going to be harder to even sustain attention. Simplicity is a snoozer after a while.
So, repetition versus creativity. And do you look at the importance for this to be part of a series of repetition or making ads in general, singular ads, more memorable? And I'll give you an example. A Super Bowl ad, for example, costs millions of dollars. It's not prudent generally to spend, say, $40 million to run $5 million ad 8 times so that it's more memorable. However, if you did something over the top with one ad, then maybe that can be shown once and it becomes stickier, if you will, to our memories. They both work together, but what is more important to this process, to the normal advertising puzzle? Is it repetition or creativity?
I really like that question because if we had to phrase it from a scientific standpoint, you would that one very creative and quite likely emotionally Latin message
Mm-hmm.
would be what we call single trial learning,
Yeah.
meaning that you have exposed the brain to that one instance and suddenly it cannot help but remember it for a long time. And I'm sure for any listener right now, we all have those kinds of moments. Perhaps your first kiss, people remember that. If somebody asked you, "Do you remember your second kiss?" you are less likely to remember that one.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you remember your first kiss versus the first time that you have ever done laundry in the apartment or the house that you live in, that first load of laundry was probably not single trial learning, unless something happened to the machine and it broke or it exploded. So it's from a communicator's perspective, do we have the audacity to aspire at single trial learning? And I'm posing this as a question because if the answer is yes, you know truly in your heart that you can create a message of that magnitude that can have that much of an impact on the brain, then more power to you. Unfortunately, when it comes to business messages, for example,
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit harder to aspire at single trial learning when you're talking about predictive analytics and finding insights in data, for example.
Absolutely.
So then I would say rely more on repetition if you feel that your content is not of such nature that you can associate it with something that is that's so intense. And repetition is after all, the mother of memory. And you don't have to be afraid of it. Sometimes I'm noticing that as we work with a lot of teams and corporations and we invite them to repeat their message, they shy away from it because they think that, well, we are sounding a little bit too remedial and we sound like a broken records. And surely if we say it once, then people will understand it and they will remember it. And that's not the case in business content. You will say something once and then you say it again, 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 and maybe then people will have noticed it for the first time.
Agreed. And I brought that example up, and you're welcome to use that when you're at Stanford if you wish. But I brought that example up in context to, we often hear that it takes 7 touches with a brand for someone to take an action, and I don't think that. I have not thought that has been true for a very long time, especially as the digital world has given us a million more touches and a million more pieces of content that we get hit with daily from all brands, let alone one. But I have frequently had the opportunity in creating ads or working with brands that were creating ads to try to get them to weave them more as part of a story. And I don't mean just an advertising story, but advertising plus content. And I think, unfortunately, too often I see that with brands that maybe do a price point offer and think that 1995 is going to make them memorable. But that's just that I think people remember 1995. They don't remember the brands, and there are a lot of brands that would offer the same price point example. And I don't think enough brands are spending enough time creating maybe more unified messaging so that it's not one Super Bowl ad or 8. It's a million different pieces that help weave together a more memorable story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does because as you're thinking about how do you stay on people's minds, and the question is important by the way because your audience's brains are only going to make decisions based on what they remember, not on what they forget. So as you're thinking about this question, you have to ask, well, then what variables contribute to memory? So we already discussed a few in terms of a repetition, for example, or a good rhythm between something that is simple, something that is complex. What you are referring to with your statements is this other notion of association, because how do memories often come to our mind? They come to mind based on something reminding you of something else. So when if 1995 is a segment that's important to you, then what you have to work on is make sure that there's the association of 1995 with you and not with anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
So as you talk about not necessarily focusing on just repetition or just on creative, but perhaps a million different pieces, I like how you put that. One of the advantages that you get out of a wide breadth of offerings or approaches is that you enable the brain to build more associations. So, for instance, if I wanted you to remember the word chocolate, I could mention a chocolate bar. I could mention a chocolate milk. I could mention chocolate cookies. I could mention chocolate other things. So the more of these associations I start building in your brain, then the next time that you see chocolate, you have an increased amount of chances to reflect back on this moment. Because the next time that you might see, for instance, the word milk, it might remind you of the chocolate. And
Mm-hmm.
next time that you see the word cookie, it might remind you of the chocolate. And the next time that you see something else that we built in our inventory might remind you of this. So, if you aspire being memorable, work on a wide array of associations that you can build in somebody's brain related to you.
So I also read your book after I got a chance to see you speak. I ordered a copy of Impossible to Ignore. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Uh,
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. No. So what are some other memory influencing variables that brand advertisers and agencies can use to help control what people remember?
There's a variable that I'm constantly working on to inspire people to use in their content, and that's called context.
Yes.
And context is so huge to memory because context is not what we remember, but rather how we remember. So I'm sure that if you go to your hometown, for example, the minute that you start walking on those streets, all sorts of memories are flooding your brain, memories that you thought were not even there anymore. Or perhaps if you go to your old high school and you entered that building, the minute that you turn left or right on some of the corridors, your brain just becomes flooded with all sorts of memories. Context is how we remember a physical context. And unfortunately, the mistake that I see a lot of business communicators make is that they speak in so many abstracts and address so many concepts that are devoid of context, and therefore missing out on an occasion to remind the brain of what memories are about. So I'll give you an example. In our business, we help a lot of teams recreate their presentations, whether they are sales pitches or investor decks. We create PowerPoint presentations from the angle of what should be memorable to somebody else when you're no longer in the room. And I think we've now gotten many of our clients to come along with the notion of tell us what should be memorable. So already the clarity of your message gets something that's that's memorable. But then when once we get to that clarity, what does it come back to us? In what format does it come back to us in? It's like three circles. Let's just say that you want people to remember that what your product is, that it works, and then you have some clinical evidence for example. And those are like three big circles on the screen. And the brain doesn't remember three big circles because guess what? They will see three big circles on a PowerPoint slide from you, and then they will see three other circles from somebody else, and three other circles from yet somebody else. And after a while, all of these just get smushed into one memory, and you won't know who said what. Interference, by the way, is one of the biggest culprits of forgetting. So we're saying this is just this recent client that we're trying to inspire to have a more physical context in what they're advocating. This presentation is about fixing something in your pelvic area, your pelvic floor health, in order to improve the quality of life. So instead of showing some circles that are devoid of context on the screen, why not have those circles be the inside of a bicycle? So as you're biking with your friends, so now you have four circles to play with because it's four wheels. So four perhaps concepts that we want these people to remember, place those in a physical context, and you have an increased chance at being memorable.
Well, I couldn't agree more about context. I just gave a presentation last week and devoted some time to talk about that in ad optimization and just the amount of wasted spend. That's another component of it that drives me crazy. But you work with a lot of large brands that I've seen. They also work with a lot of external teams. You have a lot of internal departments that work together but sometimes can get separated in some of their messaging, and you've got a lot of external teams that work with those internal teams across a wide variety delivering a message. What kind of guidance have you given, or do you give guidance on how to keep that messaging more simple, unified, creative, so that they can deliver better ads and stories that are more memorable and deliver it with more context and deliver it to be more impactful to a consumer?
Usually, when we approach any kind of communication design, regardless of if we're working with internal teams, external teams, we always start from this question of what do you want your audiences to remember? And if that answer starts becoming clear, then it also unifies anyone who's contributing to that message. So, for example, I was just reflecting on a campaign for a company that sells office furniture, a similar brand as IKEA. They're also European, and their unifying theme was perfectly organized. That was their tagline. And the minute that you have the clarity of this kind of message, you know the promise that you're making to your audience and what they should remember, then it doesn't really matter if you're working with two people internally or 200 internally and externally. Everybody has the same memory to hook into and bring to life. So clarify, we call that clarify the 10% message because your audiences will forget 90%, sometimes even more after 48 hours. Clarify your 10% message and you can align with any other workforce.
I tell you, having worked with a lot of brands and for brands, I find that to be one of the biggest challenges because so often brands are large and they start farming it out, and it's the further away it gets from the source, the more mixed the messaging it gets with
Mm-hmm.
conversation strategies. And I just worked for a large brand, large national brand who worked with a ton of agencies, and the amount of conversations that get askew a hair. It's like where you start, you know, saying the word, baby aspirin, and then by the end of the line, as you push that messaging out, it becomes rubber baby buggy bumper, and it's what that gets to the once that gets
Mm-hmm.
to the consumer, it's completely lost. And I find that so often that it's not just where I've worked in the past, but with a lot of companies, and I find that hurts making ads memorable because they get ads and stories and brand messaging memorable because they get too askew from the original message.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And one piece of advice that we have for our clients is as we embark on making something memorable, we'll provide some options for messages and we will listen to them and create several possibilities. And we always tell them to pick the one that they have the best chemistry with because otherwise, if you select something and your chemistry with that message is not strong, then repetition, which is one of the variables that we mentioned, is not going to hold because you can't possibly repeat something that you don't have chemistry with. For
Mm-hmm.
example, we're working with a client, and the message that they had selected from a few options we gave them was commit to the difference. That's what they wanted to remind their
Mm-hmm.
own audiences during this event. And commit to the difference sounded good in theory. It sounded good during some of our meetings. But what we noticed is that when we started creating some presentations around this and some other artifacts that would be present at their event, they were shying away from it. And even as people were on stage, they were just not really fully saying that phrase. They started paraphrasing it and positioning it from many other angles, but commit to the difference. So we're wondering what happened to our 10% message.
Mm-hmm.
So the lesson for all of us is, as you aspire being memorable, know that repetition is the mother of memory, but you can only repeat something that you strongly believe in and you enjoy. I want to remind all of our listeners that we must all be humbled by how quickly the brain forgets.
Yes.
And once we have that kind of humility, then it's a little bit easier to start creating messages because we don't aspire at that single trial learning that we're talking about. So incremental memories are probably more likely where the messages are concerned. So once you have the clarity of your 10% message and you know what you want to repeat, stay focused and find as many associations with that message as you can. And you will find a more memorable path onto your audience's brains.
Of course. Do you find that our brains are more primed to take in more memorable content during any particular phase?
Yes, I like your perspective, and you're mentioning a term that is very dear to my heart as a cognitive neuroscientist. One of the areas of research that I'm embarking on right now is related to just that, priming the brain, because often it's a lot easier for your audience's brains to decide in your favor if
Yes,
the brain is primed a specific way. Just like when you're painting your room and you have to apply a primer so that the
exactly.
final wall color looks what you envisioned it. It's no different than the brain. Or if you're stretching a little bit before doing some extraneous exercises, every single thing that you do is interlinked with the next and the next and the next. So priming the brain then becomes an important factor. So if you're simply working on awareness, for example, if we go back to that funnel, obviously as people interact with you, even small things such as making something look aesthetically pleasing or making something clear or making something easy to navigate, that's priming the brain to become more aware of what you want to provide. If you go back further down and you want to engage somebody in a conversation, even then, likability, for instance, might be a good primer for somebody wanting to engage with you. So, as a practical guideline for all of us, often ask not only what do I want people to remember and take away from this segment, but can I prime the brain first in such a way that they even want to go there?
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So, are there any other tools that you can recommend that makes our messaging more memorable?
Well, I think you're on the right track in terms of asking, are there any tools that people can use in order to incorporate some elements that make a message more memorable? And from our standpoint, because our own clients have been asking for this, we have been working for the past year and a half to create a tool that's called Slide Club. You know how you have a club for many other things, such as you might belong to a wine club or a chocolate club, where each month you receive various chocolates from different parts of the world. With the Slide Club, when you go to slideclub.com, you sign up and you receive either 5 slides or 10 slides per month. And we have tested these slides with EEG technology to ensure that they attract attention and sustain it. And the critical word is sustain attention, because what we invite presenters to do is to sprinkle some of these slides through their own decks and put them before a point they want to make memorable. And if we go back to this conversation we had about priming the brain, what we advocate is that you wouldn't want your audience necessarily to remember these slides that you're downloading from the Slide Club collection. You want people to remember the slide after, which is important to you. So prime the brain with ours because we can already guarantee that they will attract attention and that attention lingers in the brain for 30 seconds up to a minute after you have displayed that more intense slide. So treated well and placed right after these intense slides, and a point that is important to you and to your audience. And that's one instance in which you can use a tool to prime the brain so that they pay attention and remember what you want them to remember.
Fantastic. So, Dr. Simon, as you may remember, you're on a Shark's Perspective, and you live in San Francisco, where I was just reminded over the weekend, outside the bay, there's good diving in where I like to go for looking for sharks. So I'm going to ask an odd question. What is your favorite kind of shark and why?
It's funny because you're talking about priming the brain, and our
Yes,
brain
this is completely the opposite of that.
our brain tends to be cognitively lazy, so it only wants to go to something that is immediately available. And as I do a lot of travel, the very first show, for some reason, that seems to be displayed on those screens in front of you is Shark Tank. So
Yes.
when you mentioned the favorite type of shark, I'm immediately not brought here into the bay, but I'm brought onto a TV screen. And
Yeah,
I so enjoy quite often listening to that show because it,
you and me both.
yeah, you enjoy it as well.
Oh, I love it. I don't know that I've ever missed an episode, to be honest. I could binge watch that as much as I could Game of Thrones.
See, there you go. So it holds our attention. There's a lot to learn from that show. And we can learn from that show from two perspectives. One is from the perspective of how the presenters do their pitches. So here we are helping organizations make their presentations more memorable. So it's definitely a good lesson for all of us. But you can also learn from all of the sharks' responses. And some of my favorite segments, which will bring us to favorite sharks, is their reaction when they start competing against each other. Because now the game is raised a little bit, and the stakes are quite often high. And I'm always surprised when they start fighting with each other.
Yeah,
And just on a recent episode, they were fighting with each other because one of the sharks wanted to give money without wanting to figure out a little bit more about some tool that the person was selling. She just believed in it just very quickly. And the other sharks got so upset to the point where they got up and left simply because they felt like the person was not investing. They were performing an act of charity. And I'm enjoying these elements of surprises. So, a good lesson for all of us is in your communication, at some point, do you take the brain by surprise?
exactly. Well, then I'm going to go with the answer of Hammerhead, because when they
Sure.
show the graphic of Shark Tank and the buildings around it, there's a school of hammerheads that looks like what I've seen on a trip. They're known for where you see them in the Galapagos Islands, and that migration. But I'm going to go with Hammerhead. So
Let's go with
let's
that.
go with that one. Well, Carmen, it's that special time in the show. Are you ready for the 5 most interesting and important questions that you're going to be asked today?
Yeah, sure.
There's no priming here either. So, well, there's a little bit of priming on this first one then. All right.
Okay.
So, number 1, Mark Cuban or Damon John?
I'll go with Damon.
Okay. Number 2, Forgetting Sarah Marshall or Forget Paris? And I had to ask an expert on memory about these two movies.
Ooh, I kind of like Forget Paris.
Yeah, it was good. Billy Crystal was good then. Number 3, Roses or Myosotis? Do you know what Myosotis is?
No.
Those are commonly known as forget-me-nots.
Oh, I see. I see.
See the
That
that was a nice tie-in.
I really like that tie-in. So of course we have to pick that one.
Okay. Number 4, Kevin Durant or Steph Curry?
Let's go with Steph Curry.
All right. Number 5, and the most important question that you're going to be asked today that is memorable, is biscuits or cornbread?
Ooh, I like cornbread. It's more versatile.
Not a bad point at all. So, Carmen, where can people find out more about you, get your thought leadership, look at Slide Club, and more?
Yeah, come and check out the company's name is Memzy, MEMZY.com. And as you're mentioning, one of the most recent services and tools we have is called Slide Club. You can find that out at slideclub.com. And we would love to have you as a member so that you can be on your way to becoming memorable and influencing how your customers make decisions.
Outstanding. Dr. Simon, thank you so much for being with us today on A Shark's Perspective.
Thank you for inviting me.
So there was my conversation with Dr. Carmen Simon, the founder of Memzy, an instructor at Stanford University, an author, and she's a subject matter expert who holds doctorates in both instructional technology as well as cognitive psychology. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from our conversation with her. First, when creating marketing and communications materials, don't worry as much about short attention span. Worry about how frequent your stimulus is. But please don't forget your frequency capping, my friends. Any one ad a gazillion times, yeah, it's a bit too much. Second, it's very often that I talk about keeping a message simple. However, I love a deeper elaboration from Carmen on not keeping it so simple that the brain tunes it out to become a snoozer. Also, as she said, the audience may not appreciate a lack of complexity. She went on to say that you should be prepared to go into some depths and layers with it, and I agree. You can make your message simpler, but don't dumb it down too much because your message may be tuned out. And when I speak about simpler, I often am talking about unifying that messaging that is simple and not too complex because you think that customers are taking the time to pull apart the many layers of who you think they are as a brand. They're not. Just deliver a simpler, more unified message that stimulates the brain, repeat it and repeat it again. Switch the stimulus in order to sustain attention, but keep the message simple-ish and unified. And never forget that as we silo out efforts to other teams, internal and external, you still have to keep a clear and consistent message. Third, enable the brain to make more associations. If you aspire to be memorable, work on a wide array of associations that you can build on somebody's brain related to you and your brand. Use context for your content. Context is not what you remember, but how you remember. Brands speak in so many abstracts that don't remind the brain of memories. And as she said, and I quote, "We must all be humbled by how quickly the brain forgets. And once we have that kind of humility, then it's a little bit easier to start creating messages. Let's prime the brain and create incremental memories." Got a question? Send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you for the privilege of your time. Please consider leaving a review. So one thing you cannot forget, and that's to join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.